Welcome to our Emerging Issues webinar. Our presentation today is on the emerging risks to watch in 2024. And we're very happy that so many of you are here to join, to listen, to watch, and to participate in the conversation. I'm your host, Andy Blanchard, and I lead our Emerging Issues team here at Verisk. We hold these webinars throughout the year and bring you our latest insights and position the P&C community to address all these new and evolving risks as they emerge. That's what we do, and we love doing it. So with that, allow me to begin with our policy statement. The policy of Verisk Analytics and subsidiary companies is to comply in all respects with federal and state antitrust laws. With this in mind, we want to mention that during all seminars held under our auspices, this policy prohibits discussion of certain topics. Because we want to avoid even the appearance of an antitrust violation, we go beyond the letter of the law, and we will not discuss any matter that violates the spirit of the antitrust laws or could be perceived as doing so. A copy of our policy statement on discussion in meetings can be found at verisk.com/statement. And with us on the line is Verisk attorney Ananya Barman. Ananya, would you like to come in and say a few words?
Yes, thank you, Andy. Hello, everyone. As Andy mentioned, my name is Ananya Barman, and I am in-house counsel at Verisk. Just briefly, my role as the Verisk attorney at these meetings is to ensure that we abide by the guidelines that are presented in our policy statement and discussion in meetings, which, as Andy previously mentioned, can be found at the link that's displayed on the screen. I'm not going to go through all the limitations, but just as a general matter, it is our company policy to comply with all respects of federal and state antitrust laws, and of course, any other laws that may apply. So our policy statement does restrict discussion of certain topics, which are described in detail therein. But the reason why we bring this up today is that these restrictions can also apply to any questions or comments that are submitted through the chat feature, and of course, our presenters' responses to them. So one rule of thumb I'd like to share at these meetings to guide these discussions is that while we cannot talk about what specific companies are doing or should be doing, or for example, what your specific company procedures are, we do encourage our attendees and our presenters to share their general insights as insurance professionals in this industry. So if you have any questions about what I just described, please let us know so I can address them. But with that, I'll just turn it back to Andy in the interim. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananya. We've got a full presentation, so I just want to hit on a few points before I talk to the slide that's on the screen. First of all, your feedback, your questions, very important to us. So do use the chat function and go to webinar, put your questions up there, share your comments. Rest assured, only we here at Verisk can see what you put in the chat. And if we are unable to get to your question during the live event, we will nonetheless follow up with you afterwards. Also, because we get the question every time, we are recording the presentation today. We intend to post it on our website at core.verisk.com. So you can sit back and just enjoy the presentation, and we'll publish those slides as well with the recording probably in about a week or so. So what we're looking at here on the slide, hopefully most of us have seen this before. It's our Emerging Issues Bracket Challenge with the results of this year's insurer selections shown. And while this is, kind of a lighthearted way to capture some of our industry sentiments, it deals with some serious and vexing emerging risks. Now, even though, as you see, Gen AI rose to the top of this year's bracket, probably no one was surprised there. I want to note that, yeah, we are covering the emerging risks to watch in 2024, but we're not really going to focus on Gen AI today because we have two other really informative presentations. If you haven't seen them, we're going to be posting them on our website very soon, hopefully in about a week or so. But we're going to kind of look at some things beyond Gen AI that have performed pretty well on this bracket challenge. So with that, next up is Kevin Sullivan from our Emerging Issues team. Kevin, take it away.
Thanks, Andy. To kick off our discussion, I'll be taking us through the topic of microplastics. Though they made their debut in the Emerging Issues Bracket Challenge only this year, Microplastics managed to make it all the way to the final four in this year's Bracket Challenge. We're therefore going to take a look at some of the more recent research and risks related to these plastics. But before we dive into that data, let's do a little bit of a refresher. Microplastics can measure less than 5 millimeters in diameter, no bigger than that of a grain of rice, and come in a variety of shapes and colors. Even smaller microplastics, those commonly referred to as nanoplastics, can measure between 1 and 1,000 nanometers across. That's 1,000th the average width of a human hair. Some microplastics, such as microbeads, have in fact been in production for decades, used in items such as personal care products. Today, microplastics can be found in everything from cleaning products and textiles to artificial turf and fishing nets. Microplastic pollution is generally categorized between primary sources designed for commercial use, such as those aforementioned microbeads, in addition to nurdles, which we'll have a little bit more on in just a bit, and also secondary sources that leak into the environment through the degradation and fragmentation of larger plastic products, such as water bottles. Due to their size, scientists have raised additional concerns about the potential toxicity of nanoplastics. For instance, in a 2022 study published in the journal Environmental Chemistry Letters, researchers found that nanoplastics can be simultaneously sources, carriers, and sinks of a wide range of environmental pollutants, potentially compounding their toxicity. We'll delve into that a bit more in just a few minutes. Next slide, please. Which brings us to nurdles. A primary building block for much of the world's plastics production, an estimated 335 tons of these pellets are used each year in the production of toys, water bottles, medical supplies, car parts, and more. To provide a sense of scale, estimates from one study conducted at the University of Texas found that it takes approximately 1,000 nurdles to make one plastic bottle, more than 600 nurdles to make a toothbrush, and more than 150 nurdles to make a plastic grocery bag. Nurdles themselves are derived from hydrophobic polymers, tiny hydrocarbon-based materials like polypropylene and polyethylene, both of which are derived from petroleum. Other toxic chemicals and bacteria can collect on their surface. Being hydrophobic, they expel rather than absorbing those potentially toxic chemicals, allowing them to concentrate on the surface of the pellets, according to experts. Due to their size, nurdles are prone to escape and spill into the environment at practically every stage of the production process, during manufacturing and during transportation by truck or at sea. And escape they do. Nurdles presently account for the second largest source of primary microplastic pollution in our oceans. It is estimated that 11.5 trillion nurdles escape into the world's oceans alone each year, an estimated 200,000 metric tons. These small pellets, like all microplastics, can wreak havoc on local marine life, in addition to local economies. In May 2021, a chemical cargo ship caught fire off the coast of Sri Lanka, smoldering for several days before finally sinking into the Indian Ocean. The burning and subsequent sinking of the Singapore-registered Express Pearl exposed the surrounding waters to a variety of potentially toxic chemicals, among which included more than 1,600 tons of nurdles. Since the ship's sinking, these nurdles have been found piled along shores of nations throughout the region. They've been identified inside the stomachs of dead dolphins and also brought the coastal fishing economy near the site of the incident to a halt. And while the Sri Lanka nurdle spill stands out as a glaring and alarming example of microplastics exposure, the actual size and scope of the problem is much larger, as we'll discuss next. Next slide, please. Now, we just touched upon how microplastics like nurdles can find their way into our environment. And while nurdles account for a large percentage of oceanic microplastic pollution, their various entry points and potential harm pathways are broader, according to experts. One of the primary culprits behind microplastic distribution is Mother Nature itself. Storm runoff driven by heavy rainfall can wash microplastics from streets and sidewalks down into storm drains, which can then flow into rivers, lakes, and oceans, contaminating aquatic ecosystems and posing a threat to marine life. Research, moreover, shows that coastal environments, such as fjords, lagoons, and estuaries, are more apt to trap and compile microplastic particles. And while rivers are more prone to move and distribute these small plastics to deeper waters, microplastics can still have negative effects on riverbeds. A 2023 study, for instance, found that plastics can potentially increase sediment erosion and potentially even lead to flooding. Environmental exposure also plays a role in the distribution of microplastic pollutants. Secondary plastic pollution, like that from discarded water bottles, can, according to researchers, disintegrate in ocean waters due to microbes and the saline content of the water, potentially reducing these plastics to smaller and smaller nanoplastics. Wind, waves, solar exposure, and UV radiation can also eat away at plastic waste. If reduced enough, these plastics can be whipped up to the surface of the water and even carried into the air by the wind. Finally, microplastics can access the environment via industrial and even household effluents and pollution. As we established earlier, primary products like nurdles can leak into the environment from a variety of entry points in the industrial process. From there, such microplastics can access municipal wastewater treatment plants, where research suggests the plastics can have a compounding effect. Once contained and treated in these facilities, the recycled sewage sludge produced at wastewater treatment plants is often reused for fertilizer and other land applications. This sludge can reintroduce concentrated microplastics into our environment. And while studies show that wastewater treatment plants remove a majority of microplastics, approximately 80 to 90%, depending on the facility, according to one study, they still serve as a major distributor of microplastic pollution. Private industry isn't the only source of this environmental exposure, however. We, unfortunately, share a large slice of the blame. One 2015 study, for example, estimated that more than 800 trillion plastic microbeads are washed down American household drains every day. Among those, approximately 8 trillion make it through wastewater treatment and into our rivers, lakes, and oceans. That's trillions of microplastics from toothpaste, shower gels, face scrubs, wet wipes, sanitary items, and more. Doing your laundry, I regret to inform you, also doesn't help. Polyester, nylon, acrylic, these and other synthetic fibers used in the manufacturing of our clothing are all introduced to the environment via the washing process, according to analysts. These textile-based microplastics account for 35% of engineered microplastics in the ocean, according to one report. Next slide, please. Now that we've addressed how microplastics are exposed to our environment, let's delve into the potential effects these synthetic plastics are reportedly having on that environment. You can see here that, according to one report, 8 million tons of plastics reach our oceans each year in total. But this figure doesn't provide the entire picture on microplastics. At least 14 million tons of microplastics have accumulated on the ocean floor, according to reports, while an additional 1.5 million enter our oceans annually. From there, these plastics can be consumed by marine mammals and aquatic life, dolphins, fish, birds, and according to research, choke or deprive these creatures of nutrient absorption. According to one assessment, 75% of commercial fish have ingested plastic at one point or another. Beyond our waters, microplastics can also have a harmful effect on our soil. Often introduced in the form of fertilizers, these plastics can, according to one study, alter the soil nutrient levels and harm microorganisms and fauna communities in the soil. Next slide, please. Recent research has identified these tiny plastics throughout the human body, in our blood, our lungs, and in our vital organs. And though there has been no shortage in recent years of reports on the probable health risks posed by microplastics, endocrine system disruption, reproductive problems, and neurodevelopmental complications, just to name a few, the science had nevertheless been inconclusive. New studies may be shedding more conclusive light on the problem, however. For instance, a March 2024 study published in the New England Journal of Medicine found that patients within whom micro or nanoplastics had been detected were at an elevated risk for a cardiovascular event such as heart attack or stroke as compared to those with no evidence of plastics contamination. This was the first data of its kind to draw a link between microplastics and their impact on human health, according to one recent report. One other study, also published earlier this year, found microplastics in every human testicle examined, suggesting a possible link to the decades-long decline in global sperm counts, according to the researchers. Finally, as we discussed earlier in the case of nurdles, microplastics have the potential to serve as carriers of other potentially toxic and harmful chemicals due to their hydrophobic surfaces, or otherwise introduce similarly concerning substances into the environment, such as phthalates and PFAS. Next slide, please. Class action lawsuits pertaining to microplastics have also risen, according to one report. Much of the litigation to date pertaining to microplastics has revolved around claims of false advertising, cases brought, for example, against bottled water companies claiming their products to be natural, and other lawsuits brought by conservationists against plastic manufacturers and shipping companies have invoked elements of the U.S. Clean Water Act. However, as the body of scientific evidence linking microplastics to human health risks continues to grow, so too may the scope and size of litigation in the years ahead. According to just one report, the petrochemical industry alone could face billions in legal claims by 2030. Having covered the science and size of this growing risk, I'm now going to turn things over to my colleague, Laura Panesso, who's going to take us through key legislative and regulatory trends on microplastics. Laura?
Thanks, Kevin. So perhaps not surprisingly, California has really been leading the way with respect to legislation and regulation around microplastics. California's first piece of legislation that specifically applied to microplastics was back in 2007, and it placed strict regulations on the manufacture, handling, and transport of pre-production plastic pellets. Then in 2015, California passed legislation that prohibited the sale of personal care products containing plastic microbeads, only a few months prior to the enactment of a similar federal ban. In 2018, the California legislature adopted a pair of bills that required the state to begin building microplastics management strategies for both drinking water and California's coastal ocean and estuaries. They followed that up in 2020 by adopting a definition of microplastics in drinking water. And in 2022, California's statewide microplastics strategy was approved, which provides a multi-year roadmap for California to take a national and leadership role in managing microplastics pollution. Although California has led the way, many states and territories have also adopted regulations on plastics, specifically with respect to single-use bags and disposable restaurant utensils and containers. Over 14 states, 6 territories, and the District of Columbia regulate the use and recycling or impose fees on such products. Meanwhile, several states have enacted regulations regarding use of microbeads in personal care products and the storage and handling of plastic resin pellets or powdered coloring for plastics. Interestingly, some states have adopted legislation that prohibits local, city, and county governments from issuing regulations regarding usage restrictions and disposal or recycling of plastics and plastic products. Examples include Alabama, which prohibits local communities from deciding how to manage plastic waste, Mississippi, Idaho, and Wisconsin, which prohibit local governments from adopting requirements restricting use or sale of plastic bags, cups, bottles, and other packaging, and Montana, which prohibits local governments from adopting or enforcing ordinances regulating the use or sale of auxiliary containers like bags and bottles. On the federal front, there's been some activity as well. Back in December of 2015, Congress amended the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act by passing the Microbead-Free Waters Act of 2015. This act prohibits the manufacturing, packaging, and distribution of rinse-off cosmetics containing plastic microbeads. This new law also applied to products that were both cosmetic and non-prescription, so including over-the-counter drugs such as toothpastes. In 2020, Congress passed the Save Our Seas 2.0 Act, which required the Interagency Marine Debris Coordinating Committee to submit to Congress a report on microfiber pollution that included, among other things, recommendations for reducing microfiber pollution and a plan for how federal agencies can lead that reduction effort. Then in April of 2023, the EPA issued its draft national strategy to prevent plastic pollution, which provides voluntary actions that can be implemented in the US, aimed at eliminating the release of plastic waste from land-based sources by 2040. One of the objectives identified in the draft strategy is to prevent microplastics from entering waterways. And then just back in April of this year, the Biden-Harris administration issued a first ever national legally enforceable drinking water standard to protect communities from exposure to harmful PFAS, also known as forever chemicals. This final rule represents the most significant step to protect public health under EPA's PFAS strategic roadmap. And then just a couple of notes on the international front. In September of 2023, the EU adopted measures that restrict microplastics that are intentionally added to products under the EU chemical legislation known as REACH. The new rules prevent the release to the environment of about 500,000 tons of microplastics and will prohibit the sale of microplastics as such and of products to which microplastics have been added on purpose and that release those microplastics when used. The EU's Zero Pollution Action Plan, which set a target to reduce microplastics pollution by 30% by 2030, includes several proposals intended to reduce human exposure to microplastics. The 2023 REACH revision is the first such measure. That also includes a ban on loose glitter and microbeads, and that went into effect in October. Most recently, in January of 2024, the European Council and European Parliament reached a provisional political agreement on a proposal to remove microplastics and other micropollutants out of urban wastewater. Under this proposal, at least 80% of the costs needed to remove pollutants in the sewage treatment process would be covered by pharmaceutical and cosmetic producers, in line with the polluter pays principle. By 2045, the provisional agreement would require EU member states to remove a broad spectrum of micropollutants from urban wastewater before releasing it into the environment. And I will turn it back to Greg.
Great, thank you, Laura. So now we are going to segue to another perennial challenger in the bracket challenge, which is social inflation. And to get this started, I'm actually going to turn it back over to Laura for a quick overview of what we're seeing on the regulatory and legislative frontier.
Yes.
Laura.
Thanks, Greg. So third-party litigation funding was introduced to the United States probably around 2010, at least according to a report from the U.S. Government Accountability Office. And to date, there are no federal rules that explicitly require the disclosure of third-party litigation funders, despite strong public appeals by industry groups to create such regulations. Some state governments have proposed and implemented their own third-party litigation fund disclosure laws. In 2024, Indiana acted a law to block foreign entities from funding lawsuits in the state, to forbid the companies from influencing the outcome, and to require the funding to be disclosed in the litigation. West Virginia has also enacted a law that bars funding companies from offering commissions to attorneys and medical providers who refer clients to the company, advertising false or misleading information, referring clients to specific attorneys, and attempting to waive settlements. There's also been some failed efforts. Florida proposed a sweeping Consumer Protection Act on litigation financing, which would have required the full disclosure of third-party funders and prohibited them from influencing the applicable litigation. It has, though, failed to move. At least 10 other states this past session, including Louisiana and Kansas, also considered litigation legislation concerning litigation funding as well. On the federal front, the Protecting Our Courts from Foreign Manipulations Act of 2023 was introduced by Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana and Senator John Manchin of West Virginia in September of 2023. The act would require disclosure from any foreign person or entity participating in civil litigation as a third-party litigation funder in U.S. federal courts. It would ban sovereign wealth funds and foreign governments from participating in litigation finance as a third-party litigation funder, either directly or indirectly, and would require the Department of Justice's National Security Division to submit a report on foreign third-party litigation funding throughout the federal judiciary. This aimed to address, in part, the fact that there are no current federal rules requiring disclosure. In addition, the U.S. Chamber backs state efforts and has warned of the risks of litigation finance. And then just a couple of statistics on nuclear verdicts. In 2023, 89 lawsuits against a corporate defendant resulted in a nuclear verdict award, a 15-year high. And this is anticipated to rise further in 2024. The 2023 median nuclear verdict rose to 44 million, up from a low of 21 million in 2020. And the states with the largest sum of verdicts were Missouri at 4 billion, Texas at 3.7, Pennsylvania at 1.2, and Washington at 1.1. Florida came in at 492, dropping to number 7 in 2023, historically having been number 2, perhaps influenced by the passing of comprehensive tort reform into law. In addition, in 2023, Governor Ron DeSantis also signed House Bill 837, Civil Remedies, to decrease frivolous lawsuits and prevent predatory practices of trial attorneys. This bill modified the bad faith framework, eliminated one-way attorneys' fees and fee multipliers, and ensured that Floridians couldn't be held liable for damages if the person suing was more at fault. Additionally, this bill expanded immunity for property owners defending against a criminal who's injured on their property, while providing uniform standards for juries in calculating medical damages and reducing the statute of limitations for general negligence cases from 4 years to 2. Several other states have also taken tort reform action. In 2021, Montana passed legislation which revised civil liability laws related to damages in lawsuits. The bill seeks to limit the kind of phantom damages that stem from artificially inflated damage totals. These phantom damages occur anytime a lawsuit recoveries are calculated using the dollar amount a patient was billed for medical service instead of the amount the patient, insurer, Medicare, Medicaid, or workers' compensation actually paid for treatment. Iowa passed legislation last year that limits non-economic damages awarded in a civil lawsuit against trucking companies to $2 million, but it does not limit economic damages such as lost wages or medical expenses. And lastly, Texas also has enacted legislation to level the future of litigation playing field for truckers. It includes a provision that will allow properly authenticated photographs or videos of a vehicle or object involved in a collision to actually be admitted into evidence. In addition, it allows for the bifurcation of trials so that one trial is for evidence as to liability and the second trial would allow allegations of unsafe motor carrier safety practices to be introduced. And with that overview, I will turn it over to my colleague, Tim.
Thank you, Laura. So one way to look at social inflation is taking a look at insurance data. And you can't really specifically say changes that you're seeing are directly impacted by social inflation. But given our understanding of social inflation over the last 10 years, one item has been higher loss amounts in general, especially from a liability perspective. So one place where we took the ISO data is took a look at commercial umbrella excess policies that generally provide coverage for higher limits above a general liability and commercial auto policy. And in looking at the ISO data, one thing that we recognized over time, again, starting in 2014 as shown by this chart, is that the experience for commercial umbrella excess started to worsen. It started to worsen in a way where it brought the calendar year loss ratios closer, where commercial umbrella had generally been more favorable, in 2013 and before. And you see this worsening take place with commercial umbrella excess, and you see it go into 2018 and 2019. But which definitely provides a signal that social inflation is occurring. Things start to look a little better in 2020 and 2021, and hate to disappoint everyone, but that was probably more due to the impacts of the COVID environment, to losses not settling as quickly in the past claim frequency going down in 2020 and 2021 than anything related to social inflation. And as we see here in 2022, the experience for commercial umbrella excess has again reached the point, at least when looking at this calendar year loss ratio exhibit, where it's very similar to overall general liability experience. This is one way to take a look at the data. It's comparable to the annual statement. So it's one way to look at it. It takes a look at the paid losses and the change in reserves from year to year. Additionally, looking at accident year data, you see similar patterns as well too. And at this point, from an accident year basis, what we're seeing in 2021 through 2023 is very similar to 2018 and 2018. So the pressures related to social inflation, to the extent that commercial umbrella excess experience is an indicator, seems to be continue to be an issue, despite the short-term positive signs that we saw in 2020 and at that time. So one thing I like to do, I think in all our presentations, you have these slides where we're looking forward about what we're thinking about going forward. So I actually took a slide from a presentation in the last year or two and felt it was a good time to revisit some of the things to watch. And so the first thing related to this are the drivers of social inflation. And again, how have they been impacted over the last couple of years? Have things changed? Certain items like plaintiff legal strategies that seem to have improved and may be part of the reason why we're seeing social inflation for liability insurance. You know, those tactics and procedures are still in place today, and they seem to have been very successful. Corporate distrust, that really also hasn't changed too much over the last several years, I would say. I know other people may have differing opinions. Again, some promising news related to third-party litigation funding based on what Laura described for more disclosure and things like that. Definitely good to hear, but it really hasn't, you know, third-party litigation funding has not been banned, and based on information provided by third-party litigation funders, it's a very profitable endeavor with a high return on investment. So those drivers have not gone away for social inflation, it seems. Another thing related to social inflation that, again, from a short-term basis, probably made it look like social inflation might be a little quieter. Once during the COVID environment was where the civil courts were closed or operating on a reduced capacity, and that was, you know, based on the insurer data that we have, leading to slower settlements and losses not being settled as soon as they were in the past. And we've seen some progress here. Again, the court system is operating close to, if not at, the levels prior to COVID, and the settlements have picked up to some extent for lines like commercial auto and general liability. I would still say that for general liability and commercial auto, there are still more claims open at the same point in time compared to the past, but it has gotten better. And the potential problem there is, well, if you have more older claims open and there are higher verdicts or higher settlements related to a similar claim, that may have an impact on other opening claims that might have been settled earlier in the past. Another big thing from my perspective has been the factors that ISO develops related to higher policy limits. Prior to COVID, we had seen a lot of pressures for general liability related to that. In 2021 and 2022, the results from those reviews were more flat to slightly negative, probably being impacted by the slower settlement patterns. But what we've seen more recently is that we're seeing worsening experience for both commercial auto and general liability related to higher limit policies in our reviews. And again, generally, it's been worsening experience across jurisdictions So again, the pressures, we're starting to see the pressures there again for higher limit policies and increases in those factors to price higher limit insurance. So in terms of revisiting things here, you know, a lot of what we were expecting has happened. Again, things to continue to monitor here, but the idea that social inflation was mitigated during COVID and no longer an issue, well, that does not seem to be the case. The one other thing I want to briefly touch base on is related to social inflation from an insurance company perspective. I think we can talk about data. I think we can talk about the drivers and the issues. But, you know, in thinking about it, this is an issue that touches across an insurer enterprise. It is not strictly an actuarial issue. It's not strictly a claims issue. It's not strictly a coverage issue. And given the improved plaintiff strategies that seem to have been successful in some places, that has changed the game. They're using analytics to decide which cases to try based on the facts of the case, as well as the location, and focusing on locations that seem to be more friendly to higher judgments and plaintiffs. So I guess the last point I want to leave everyone on today on this important topic is individual areas can analyze social inflation and try to react to it. Actuaries can analyze historical loss information to develop future estimates. Claims people can handle the claims, understanding how social inflation has changed expected losses. Legal strategies at insurer can change and be updated over time. But from my perspective, one of the key things to do here, if you want to mitigate the impacts of social inflation, which are never, I don't think, fully going away, is good communication between areas at an insurance company. Having a unified approach is probably going to be more successful in trying to mitigate social inflation than individual areas trying to react to it individually. So that's a short update on social inflation. I'm going to pass it back to Greg.
Great, thank you, Tim, so much for that. Very interesting. So we're now going to focus on autonomous vehicles. So I think for many of us here, this is a fairly familiar topic, but just to level set quickly, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, defines, depending on how you count this, 5 or 6 levels of autonomy, with level 0 being the least amount of autonomy, all the way up to level 5, a full-blown driverless vehicle. So today in all 50 states, you can purchase a vehicle with levels 0 through 2 functionality. And in 2 states, Nevada and California, you can buy a car from a single manufacturer that has level 3 functionality. But for the purposes of our discussion today, we're really focused on levels 3 through 5, because that kind of represents the technological step change from what we're used to with regular conventional vehicle. Now, unlike some of the subjects of today's webinar, autonomous vehicles have been a strong performer in some of our past bracket challenges. So I spent some time down in the Emerging Issues archives preparing for this presentation. I found some real gems like this vintage piece here. You can see autonomous vehicles were the top pick in the 2017 challenge, and they had a few other very strong runs, but also a couple of tough years there, including last year where they were eliminated in the very first round. Now, this isn't just a bit of Emerging Issues bracket lore, as fascinating as I find that, but I think it is kind of indicative of where we are with this technology. It's been on a lot of our radars for well over a decade now, and more than that, it's seen a significant amount of investment. One estimate pegs the amount of capital invested into autonomous vehicle technology at around $160 billion. So what we're going to do quickly is step through where we are with the rollout of this technology, what we're learning about AVs, autonomous vehicles, in the process, and where we might go from there. So to get us started, I'm actually going to turn things back over to Laura for an overview of the regulatory landscape around autonomous vehicles. So Laura, it's over to you.
Thanks, Greg. So as Greg mentioned, this is not new. We've been struggling with this autonomous vehicle question for quite a while. And since 2017, over 25 states have put laws on the books addressing driverless vehicles. There's definitely variation between states in whether they require a human driver to actually be behind the wheel and ready to take over. The most recent was Kentucky, and they passed legislation in this year, 2024, establishing a regulatory framework for the operation of fully autonomous vehicles on public highways. And just as each of those state laws vary for many, many ways, one of the ways in which they vary is autonomy and whether or not, again, a driver needs to be in the vehicle and ready to take over. So some states, including Nevada, Florida, Georgia, West Virginia, Utah, North Carolina, and North Dakota, have passed legislation in which no human driver is legally required to be behind the wheel if the vehicle's AI is capable of a level 4 or 5, in which no human interaction is necessary. In Georgia's case, the law considers the system fully autonomous if it does not at any time request that a driver assume any portion of the dynamic driving task. Of course, the challenge there is, as Greg mentioned, that only one manufacturer currently has a level 3 vehicle for sale, with all other vehicles falling at 2 or below. And just like there's differences in autonomy, there's also a wide variety of differences in insurance requirements. Varying levels of insurance are required depending on the state, if they're registered for personal use or professional testing. Some states are requiring millions in coverage for operation of autonomous commercial vehicles. Just to give you an idea about how different requirements can be, some kind of extremes, California requires autonomous vehicles to carry $5 million in coverage, whereas Arkansas simply requires the operator to carry minimum liability limits. So again, a wide variety of legislation out there. Then just a little bit about the federal landscape. Since 2016, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, NHTSA, has regularly released federal guidelines to provide safety assurance and facilitate innovation. In 2021, they began requiring reports of autonomous vehicle crashes, and this they're requiring for a level 2, which is readily available and includes technology like lane centering assistance and adaptive cruise control, as well as vehicles that are levels 3 through 5 with more advanced autonomy. The federal government's also mulling over some proposed standards for self-driving commercial vehicles. Proposed rule is expected relatively soon from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and would be in many ways a first step kind of on the federal front, as the majority of policy governing the autonomous vehicle industry has come from a kind of a patchwork of state and local governments. And with that brief overview, I will turn it back to Greg.
Great, thank you, Laura. So one of the things that NHTSA is doing as part of its autonomous vehicle efforts is to collect voluntary data on where and what type of vehicles are being tested. So what you can see here is, it may not be a complete picture, but it does give us a flavor for the type of activity we're seeing in the market. And as you can see here, cars and shuttles represent the most autonomous vehicle form factor being tested at the moment, followed by vans and trucks. And as you can see, there are AV tests active in at least 13 US states. In addition to tests, we also do have limited commercial deployments for these vehicles, principally in the form of robo-taxi services and some very limited robo-trucking services also on the horizon, principally in Texas. Now, what do all these commercial deployments have in common? Well, look at their locations. These are locations that have generally a lot of sun, not much in the way of rain or snow. This is going to become important in a minute, so just remember that factoid. So collectively, the data that NHTSA is collecting and all these tests are really serving as the foundation for the data collection necessary to answer what I think is one of the really fundamental questions about autonomous vehicles, which is, are they better drivers than humans? And it's a difficult question to answer, in part because there is still very little data. According to the Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association, AVs have traveled around 70 million miles on public roads, but by comparison, Americans collectively, we drive an average of around 3 trillion, with a T, miles every single year. So we have to do a lot of extrapolating to get an apples to apples comparison with things like crash rates and fatality rates. So according to NHTSA, this is data that they have collected since 2021 on vehicles with levels 3 through 5. 0 fatalities reported with these vehicles, but over 1,160 or 1,164 incidents. Now, an incident isn't necessarily an accident. It can also be a moment where an autonomous vehicle behaves erratically, for example, swerving into oncoming traffic, colliding with stationary objects. Now, how does this compare to a human? Well, at least in terms of fatalities, it seems roughly better, right? The human drivers experience about 1.3 fatal crashes per every 100 million miles. However, in the past several months, NHTSA has opened investigations into 4 autonomous vehicle manufacturers over all those 1,164 incidents, some alarming incidents that have triggered these investigations. But this isn't the full picture. We also have data that has been reported by at least one major robotaxi firm, and they are indicating that they are currently outperforming human drivers. In areas where this firm was operating, in Phoenix and in San Francisco, its robotaxis reportedly traveled around 7 million miles, caused 3 injuries. And according to their analysis, humans on those same roads, covering that same amount of mileage, would be in 4 times as many accidents. We also have some data that's been released from a robo-trucking firm, specifically one that's operating out of Texas, plans to scale operations in Texas later this year. They've reportedly logged about 1 million miles with their autonomous trucks. They reported 3 crashes, all of which they attributed to other human drivers, and they reported 0 fatal crashes. Now, if that accident rate of 3 crashes in 1 million miles scales to 100 million miles, which is kind of where NHTSA normalizes their data, we'd be looking at around 300 crashes per every 100 million miles. Again, if that initial pattern stays consistent. So human truck drivers, as you can see here, they have about 1/3 as many crashes per 100 million miles, though more fatalities. So that's a rough sketch of where we are with AV safety today. The next question is, where might we be going? I think for many people, it's fair to say that this is what we think, or maybe we thought, the future of this technology was, right? Something that's so robust, you can sit and read in your vehicle. Your vehicle doesn't even need a steering wheel to operate. It just sends you safely to your destination. And this may indeed be our future, at least down the road. But as I mentioned, after a decade, well over $100 billion invested in the technology, it does still appear to be significantly more constrained than this. Let's take something I mentioned earlier. Right now in the US, in 2 states, you can buy a car with level 3 autonomous driving features. But to activate those features, you have to only activate them when certain conditions are met. For example, you can only turn it on in a heavy traffic jam. You can only turn it on during the day. You can only activate the feature on specific pre-approved roads in the 2 states that I mentioned, in California and Nevada. You can only turn it on when the car is traveling less than 40 miles an hour. And the caveats with this technology remain true in those commercial deployments of level 4 and level 5 systems. Some of them I mentioned here. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to flag 2 in particular. And I chose this graphic of a traffic cone deliberately because even though AVs are packed with sensors and they can leverage machine learning for object recognition, they can still get tripped up by everyday road objects. So the traffic cone became something of a symbol in San Francisco last year when the city was debating robotaxi regulations. Apparently, activists who were not fans of robotaxis started to place traffic cones in front of or on the hood of robotaxis and completely disabled them. They can also suffer from something called phantom braking, which some researchers have noticed is a fairly common occurrence across multiple autonomous vehicle platforms. This is when a vehicle will stop suddenly without warning sometimes leading to a rear end collision. And it's suspected that this could be due to errors in the vehicle sensors, possibly identifying objects erroneously or misinterpreting what they're seeing and then slamming on the brakes. So opinions vary on how soon or even really whether a fully autonomous future is in our future, but we do have a few estimates. A 2023 forecast from S&P Global Mobility suggested that we shouldn't expect to see any level 5 vehicles sold before the year 2035. As for level 4, they estimate that worldwide we could see under 6% of light-duty vehicle sales globally by 2034 incorporate level 4 functionality. It is a different story for levels 2 and levels 3. S&P expects that sales of those vehicles collectively could reach as high as 31% by the year 2035. So this graphic here is really just a hypothetical of two pathways we might take. If we hit upon a technological breakthrough or achieve more evidence that AVs are indeed better drivers than humans, we could possibly see a much more rapid adoption. However, if we remain in the status quo, it could be a longer road before we reach full autonomy, and perhaps we would have to be restricted to more limited use cases, such as, like I said, the robotaxi services and the robo-trucking services we see today. No matter how long it takes, there are a couple of other issues that we're monitoring with this as this technology unfolds. And the first, and this is primarily a concern with level 3 systems, is how we cope with driver distraction. So level 3 can do autonomous driving in limited circumstances, but research from the National Transportation Safety Board suggests that even for the short stretches of time where drivers are not necessarily required to be monitoring the road, they can become so distracted that they fail to respond to the signals when the car tells the driver that he or she needs to resume driving. That, plus the fact that the NTSB has said that these systems still have, quote, considerable limitations in detecting hazards, means that they could pose an increased risk to the drivers. One way to mitigate that risk is to have the car more actively monitor the driver, but that leads to our second concern, which is data privacy. One way to monitor the driver is to collect biometric information on them. Where are their eyes? Are their eyes on the road at the moment? But that is all information, if it's being collected, that could potentially be exploited or surfaced in a data breach. It is at risk when these vehicles potentially get hacked, which brings us to our other concern, which is cybersecurity. We know this is a growing concern for vehicles of all levels of autonomy, from 0 to 5, but autonomous vehicles are likely to have a much wider surface area for cyber attacks. And those attacks could not only interfere with their operation, but also expose important information about the driver. And finally, a question that is near and dear, I'm sure, to everyone's hearts here: liability in an accident. Now, it might be challenging enough to determine what specific system in an autonomous vehicle contributed to an accident, but that challenge can grow exponentially more complex the more these systems get enmeshed into smart infrastructure. So one expectation for autonomous vehicles is that things like traffic lights will begin to integrate wireless communication technologies to better enable autonomous vehicles to navigate. But that entire infrastructure could make the navigation decision matrix much more complicated. So determining how an accident happened could extend well beyond the car to its surrounding infrastructure. So now I'm going to take us through our final topic of the day, which is robots. We've gone from robot cars to actually full-blown robots. And I know we don't have much time left, so I'm going to move through this section fairly quickly. Now, robots were a newcomer to the Bracket Challenge this year, but they are hardly a new concern. We've had industrial robots operating in factories for many decades now. But thanks to a convergence of factors, we are seeing their numbers start to increase. As you can see here, this is statistics from the International Federation of Robotics. There are nearly 4 million industrial robots installed around the world. And that federation notes that this install base has been growing by around 13% a year, every year since 2017. So the investment in this technology is clearly showing no signs of let up. And there are new business models such as robots as a service, which are helping drive industrial robotics into new industries, specifically smaller and medium-sized enterprises. According to one estimate, nearly 1.3 million robotic devices could be installed in small and medium-sized enterprises using this robot as a service business model by the year 2026. So a potentially very sharp increase in the number of robotics in factories and in different types of industries. Now, I mentioned this is nothing new, so there are a number of potential familiar risk exposures we'll see when this happens, such as workplace injury, error, malfunction. But there is another development in robotics which ties back to our emerging issues bracket challenge top pick this year, which is generative AI. So over the last 6 months, there's been a huge surge in interest in using the kinds of foundation models that power generative AI applications inside of robots. Now, at a high level, the hope is that these AI models could make robots smarter, better able to operate in new environments, more capable of autonomous functionality. It might also enable people to issue instructions to robots by simply speaking to them instead of programming them. And a lot like the virtual generative AI applications we've seen over the last 18 months, there's been a rush of companies, startups, but also established firms that aren't just testing this idea, but already deploying it commercially. So for example, there's a company that builds landscaping robots. They've launched a trimmer and edger product that incorporates a foundation model for spatial reasoning. There's a firm that's launched a child companion robot that's capable of conversing with children using a version of a generative AI chatbot. There are startups that are fusing foundation models with warehouse robots to enable them to work on a variety of packages without any pre-training. And there's also the pursuit of humanoid robots, kind of the thing you see represented here, that can use all of the knowledge that they've scraped off the internet, all those advanced sensors that are already being used in autonomous vehicles to make this sci-fi future a reality. But this development also raises the possibility that some of the concerns that we've already seen with generative AI virtual applications could find a new outlet in a robot. I don't have much time left, so I just want to highlight one concern here quickly, and that's biased outcomes. So generative AI models have been reportedly trained on a vast amount of internet data, so they can pull in both the good and the bad of the internet. And if you pack that into a robot, it could potentially mean the robot expresses some of those bad parts out into the world. As a case in point, researchers performed an experiment with a Gen AI model that was explicitly developed for robotics. They performed a test in a virtual environment. They basically scanned a bunch of faces, put it on a virtual table, put a box on the table, and told the robot to pack the box with images of criminals. Now, the robot was only detecting faces. It had no information on anyone's criminal background, so it really should have done nothing. It had no basis to find the criminal, or if it didn't take any action, it should have just picked up images at random, but instead, it reportedly picked up black and brown faces more often than white ones. And this is one of the reasons that at least some AI researchers have cautioned against the use of these models in robots, at least until their behaviors are better understood and more robust safeguards are put in place. There is a tension, I think, similar to the one that we see in virtual Gen AI applications between the enthusiasm to get product to market and capitalize on the interest and potential capabilities of generative AI and the ability to do so safely and securely. So with that, I know we're right up against the edge of time, but I'm going to turn things back over to Andy.
Thank you, Greg. I know we are at the edge of time here, so I'm just going to try to go through this very quickly. Can't say you didn't get your money's worth, right? Please check out our Emerging Issues website at core.verisk.com. Plenty of new content coming all the time. New an audio lab. Do check us out. While you're there, subscribe to our weekly newsletter. I'm just going to jump to the next slide here. So I don't know if the slide is, there we are. So plenty of sources here if you want to continue the journey, if you want to nerd out on nerdles. Sorry, they gave me a mic. I'm going to do this. All the details are here. You can go further and deeper on any of these issues we discussed today. Finally, I just want to thank everyone for joining us and spending their time with us. For Laura, Kevin, Greg, and Tim McCarthy, and the rest of the Verisk Emerging Issues team, thank you for spending part of your day with us. Be well with everyone and enjoy the last few days of spring.